And there's this phrase that we hear a lot when we're talking about hybrid work, and maybe Scott, you can give us your take. Our team hears the phrase hybrid is harder. Would love to hear your thoughts about the phrase.
Yeah, hybrid, is that the most used word after COVID these days? Yeah, I mean, I would say if you look pre-COVID, you saw almost everybody had an expectation of they had to be in an office. And if someone was working remotely, they were weird or an anomaly or, kind of a second-class citizen in a meeting. And then we went to this COVID experiment where everyone is remote and no one's in an office, and it kind of democratized everyone in a different way where we're all working in this way where it's flat and you can see all of our boxes. I think in hybrid, it's just talking about the idea where you have some people together in physical spaces and some that are at home and some are in other places. And I think you kind of alluded to it, Katie, where it actually creates some much more difficult challenges where you want to make sure that if every meeting is going to have people in both places, how do you technically make sure that people are equal and they're not kind of second-class citizens from a collaboration point of view?
And Meaghan, if we kind of think about this in a, very specific way, I would love to hear your thoughts. I know your organization's doing great work in the hybrid space. So what are some steps that you think orgs should take so that both groups are included and so that there is this equitable experience?
That's a great question. I think I would agree with Scott that hybrid is harder. And I think actually one of the biggest mistakes that we make as companies sometimes is trying to pretend that it's not harder, right? We can just move the office onto Zoom and it'll be fine. I think you have to be really intentional with everything that you're doing in order to make sure that you are creating that equitable culture. And so one thing is just getting a sense of what does your population look like on your specific team? What are their schedules? How often are they planning to be in the office? What are their working hours and comfortability there? So just understanding sort of a lay of the land is really important. And then what we encourage managers to do is using their leadership point of view to kind of balance the power, if you will. So if you've got 2 folks zooming in, and then you've got everybody else around a table together, you as the manager can balance out that power by also joining virtually. So there's a couple different techniques that we use, whether it's defaulting to sort of virtual only or everybody remote, or if that's not possible, balancing the power by using your leader to join in on the virtual experience if that's the minority. Those are some really helpful ways just to create an environment where at least we're all sort of on equal footing. Obviously, there's tons more layers that have to get added on after that fact, but that's a simple step you can take just to move yourself in the right direction when you are first approaching hybrid.
Scott, I'll be curious to hear your take as well. And digging into that concept of balancing the power, right? I would also love to hear from both of you about specifics that managers could do besides joining the call to help create that more equitable space. So Scott, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, maybe I'll give the balance to Meaghan. She talked about the cultural and facilitation ideas, and part of where we work a lot on is on the technology itself. So how do you make sure that the audio and video is as good as being in the same place? I think most of us know that it's working, but it doesn't always work that well. And I think part of the challenge is when you start trying to include people in a meeting room, can you hear them? Can you see them? Do they know how to use the technology? Is there some remote control that only a captain video with a cape will come in and fix everything? In some ways, this is easier. I think the experience of using Zoom where we're using it personally, but when you go into the more people in a room, it actually gets exponentially harder. So I think we focused a lot of things on just making things easier to use for people. Like to give you an example, we use AI technology. So instead of someone going to a room and picking up a remote control, the ability for the camera to auto frame on everyone and make sure they can see everyone without yelling at someone, hey, move the remote, or I can't see you. And I would say that process will extend to other things like, in addition to audio and video, how do you show a whiteboard? So I'm sure we've all experienced this. You're in a meeting and you're having this great video meeting and someone walks up to the whiteboard and your remote go, hey, I can't see anything, or it's on an angle. And so how do you bring that kind of content in? And then just like we're bringing in audio from people who may be sitting in the back of a room, I think we also have a challenge of bringing in video into the back of the room. And kind of our vision of that is like a sporting event. if you're sitting at home, there's not one camera, on your favorite sporting event. There's lots of cameras. There's an auto director always framing things, giving you stats. That's kind of our North Star in terms of how we think we need to solve the problem. And I think we're making some progress. But I'm sure you can imagine if you compare what we're doing in video meetings to the Olympics, we got a long way to go to kind of catch up with that analogy. But I think the analogy makes sense and it's apt.
As we're thinking about day-to-day life, we all know that having leaders buy into being present in the virtual meeting space is part of it, but what else can managers do to make sure that they're creating that equitable experience?
Something that can be really helpful is making sure that the sort of natural camaraderie that's created when you spend time together with someone in person. In a hybrid environment, again, if the leader is in person, then naturally the other folks in person have more opportunity to spend time, get in on conversations, make decisions. And so I think as leaders, making sure that you're really intentional about, asking everyone, how was your weekend on Slack? Where everybody, regardless of time zone, regardless of location, can equally share what went on in their weekend, how they're feeling, what they learned this week, whatever the question may be. And similarly, being really intentional and sometimes patient about, if there's an idea stirring perhaps in the office, there's a couple of you getting really excited about something, taking a step back and saying, you know what, not everyone can be included in this conversation. Let's pause and wait until we can all be in that same equitable Zoom room, if you will. And similarly, when you're offering opportunities, would anyone like to take on this project? Or is anyone interested in this event? If you're asking that at 9 a.m. Eastern time and half your team is on the West Coast, that's not equitable. You haven't asked it in a way that gives everybody the same opportunity. If you're going to have, the first person jump in, be the person that gets that opportunity. So I think being just very cognizant and intentional about the ways in which your location and your time zone can affect the opportunities and the sort of comfort level that your team has with you, all of those start to build up into your overall workplace experience. So I think those small changes make a big difference.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think where we're all going to start running into some problems is as we start this migration slowly back into offices and opening them up, we're going to have a couple of things that are going to happen to, I think, all of us. First thing is somebody's going to walk into a meeting room and schedule a Zoom meeting or Teams meeting like this, and they're going to walk in there and find that there's a speakerphone. And then you go, what the hell do I do? How do I have a video meeting? Like, I'm not used to having this. How do I set it up? And I think there's going to be a scurrying of IT people around the world saying, all right, how do I support people who are dialing in remotely? I think the second thing is going to happen is someone's going to go, wait, let's take an iPad and put it in the front of the room or a laptop, and we're all going to crowd around and then realize that that's not going to work. So, and then I think there'll be a third thing that as we're having meetings like this and everybody's looking forward, that will work. But inevitably, when you're in a room together, people will turn to each other, and then you're going to have this effect where you're looking at the sides of people's heads, and maybe you can't hear them properly. So how do you make sure as people who are in the room that you're cognizant of what people are experiencing remotely, and then vice versa? How do you speak up and say, I can't hear you, I can't see you, or and I think there'll be a combination, as Meaghan said, there'll be some technology, but also be being aware and cognizant just socially that I think there's going to be this natural inclination to do what we did before. Just start talking to each other in the room, and we're going to have to make sure that we're including people who are remote, calling on them, making sure they're part of the conversations, and not going back to this second-class citizen effect of people who are dialing in remotely.
You both bring up such an important point of this self-awareness, awareness of yourself, awareness of others' perspectives. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've seen on our team through our research, through past Networkplaceless events, is that teams don't always have an awareness of other people. And that makes it difficult often to do asynchronous communication. Makes it challenging for async communication because people aren't in front of them. It's harder to take the perspective of a person that is not in front of you. Love to hear how your teams balance async and synchronous communication. If Meaghan, you want to get started, and then we can hear from Scott.
Yeah, so admittedly, this is still a place that we're learning. I think a lot of our teams that were not formally remote or hybrid are so accustomed to just like getting it going in person. And so the switch to asynchronous is tough. But I think we found a couple approaches that have really helped us. One is using Loom or any kind of video communication where it can be exhausting, right, to read a 3-page long email or these huge Google Docs. And so using different technology, whether that's Loom, Zoom, whatever you're using, we get a weekly update from our CPO, Katie Burke, just letting us know what's going on in the org, what's on her mind, how is she feeling, and it is much more inviting and equitable to be able to have that sort of FaceTime, if you will, with her that you can do on your own time zone in your own space. The other thing we think about with asynchronous is that I think a lot of folks think asynchronous is just moving to written communication, like moving to a Google Doc, for example, and that's not enough. That can get really frustrating. So we encourage and train our teams to be really intentional. If you're going to share a Google Doc with somebody, what exactly do you need from them? In what format? Inline suggestion, just go ahead and edit, put it in a comment, send an email back. By what time? Who else should be looped in? And is there any additional follow-up or pre-research that's needed? So being really clear about what you need from other people in asynchronous communication is, I think, the part that tends to fall through the cracks a little bit. And then it's being really clear about your guidelines for different channels. So we say Slack should be used like a voicemail. If I Slack you, it's not a text. I don't expect an immediate response. It's a voicemail, which means I should say, hey, Scott, I had this question for you. When you get a chance, if you could answer me via email or set up 30 minutes on my calendar tomorrow, that would be great. I've given you all the information you need to take action on it, and you don't feel like you have to constantly be responding to me all the time, which can be exhausting when we have a bunch of different time zones working together. So just setting out those expectations for each channel can be really helpful, as well as looping in some video and some personality into async, I think can make it a little bit more fun and personable as well.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things I think that I've learned, and I think many of us have probably learned, is that when we miss having those random interactions of bumping into people, we tended to compensate by having more meetings, to the point where your schedule just gets completely filled up. And then I think you get this phenomenon, we're all working a lot more than we used to. So I think one of the things that just puts a premium on is good writing. And I think it's probably generally, I would make a statement that there are too many meetings that could be updates, where you just send an update to a broader set of people, especially for people who are not in the meeting, where you can kind of capture it. So I think it puts an emphasis on clearer writing, and not, as they say, sometimes the best meeting is no meeting. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is just have more updates regularly, where people can read it and see it, and then leave the meetings for the collaboration. And it's kind of parallel to, I think, being in the office. People are coming into the office just to work, whereas now I think people go to the office to have a collaboration session. Maybe doing the same thing about meetings. Maybe you should have more, asynchronous updates to a broader audience, but use the meeting for more interactive, collaborative stuff. I'd say the second thing that I think that I've been doing is more one-on-ones, because you're not bumping into people as much. So making sure that there are going to be some things that you're just going to miss, or things that people won't escalate or update because they're not with you. And then you find out later, oh, someone was upset about something, but they didn't have an opportunity to really share it with you because it was hard. So kind of proactively setting up more of those one-on-ones. And then I think the last thing I've done counterintuitively is more audio. Like, I've been doing these audio calls where I just roam around the neighborhood instead of sitting at the desk all day. And I think the nice thing about that is it gives you an opportunity to have a meeting with, let's say, a one-on-one, where you're not having a set agenda, but you're just roaming around mentally to different topics, as opposed to, I think this is very efficient when you're in a video call, when you have an agenda. But what if you have no agenda? Or what if you just want to mentally meander a little bit? I think sometimes we need to do that to kind of get out of our everything as a task and has an outcome. Maybe things don't have an outcome, and I find that to be very productive, where you just kind of get a chance to both walk, get some fresh air, but also have the opportunity to go out of your planned meeting to kind of other topics that you might not cover.
Totally agree, Scott. I talk about this pretty much every month. My colleague Megan and I have walkie-talkies. And so again, it's the physical roaming, and it's the agenda. I mean, there isn't one. It is a roaming conversation. So totally agree with that. And there's something that you touched on a moment ago that I'd like to dig into a bit more. You mentioned, if there's conflict, or if you're having challenges with an employee or a team, I'd like to hear a little bit about, your take on how performance management, maybe conflict management, is more challenging on a hybrid team versus fully co-located or fully distributed?
Well, I think one thing that I found recently and very specifically is that when you're in an office, you might have an opportunity to run into people at different levels of the organization, whereas without that, you're having more scheduled meetings where really you're just meeting with your tribe. And I think it makes it harder for people to kind of, if they're frustrated with something, to be able to serendipitously just tell you what's going on. So I think part of what I've been doing and encouraging my team to do is do more skip level meetings, where you're not just meeting with your direct reports or your direct team. Because I had an example a couple of weeks ago where there was someone in my team who was really frustrated about something. And I think in pre-COVID times that we may have run into them in some way. But because they're remote, we just never have an opportunity to see them, and they were just super frustrated. So I think one of the things you have to do, again, it's kind of like this idea of just like you're doing more one-on-ones, you may have to do more skip level meetings every once in a while so you have the ability to reach down to different parts of the organization and find out what's really going on in a way that they might tell you something that they might not want to reach out to you and say, hey, this is some bad thing happening. But I think it's really critical for all of us to find out not only the good stuff, but also, what are the problems that you need to solve.
Meaghan, what about you? Any thoughts for performance management? Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think being intentional about scheduling those meetings and making sure everyone has access to those leaders is important. I would also argue that it's just about being really transparent and objective. So I think we have to get away from this mentality of being at your desk means you're working. And I think what happens in the office is that you see someone, that old school, first in, last out, they're working hard. You see them typing away at their computer. That doesn't necessarily mean they're working. They're present, but they're not necessarily performing. And so from the very beginning, setting those objective measures as best you can, right? There are roles where there just aren't clear metrics, but setting very clear measures of what are you looking for at the end of a quarter or a year, understanding also what does it look like when you're not reaching those measurements? What are the red flags? When will you know? How will you raise them? And making sure that that's true whether or not somebody is in the office or not, and not relying on that presence as a measure indicator, I think is really important. I think that's going to be tough for folks who have a hybrid team where maybe one or two folks are remote and the rest of the team, including the leader, are in the office. So really holding themselves accountable as managers to make sure that everybody's held to the same standard, and that's measured really objectively and transparently, is going to be the best way to keep yourself honest in that process.
Yeah, I would probably just add to that one of the things I think we've been using, and I've been trying to use, is more of these Ask Me Anything sessions. But not only the big ones with a lot of people, doing it with smaller groups, and you may not ordinarily do it. So I think it allows you to kind of address what Meaghan's saying about reaching maybe people who are all over the place in different geographies, but also I think the smaller you get it, the more open that people are going to be. So I've been hosting a lot more of these, and I'm encouraging my team members to host more of these smaller Ask Me Anything sessions where you allow people to kind of, or encourage people, like, you have to come with questions and complaints or other things, as opposed to, otherwise people might not necessarily do it. And I think that's been an effective way of just sharing information really rapidly, but also getting all the things that are on people's minds that they may not bring up in a structured meeting because they don't want to disrupt the flow or embarrass themselves or so on.
Yeah, one thing one of our leaders always asks is, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And it's sort of this anonymous or non-anonymous, if you prefer, way to raise, here's what I'm hearing from team members on the ground, or here's what I'm hearing from prospects, here's what I'm seeing within my own team. And it's just a way of raising those types of things that leaders might not see, and can affect performance, right? If everybody's feeling really burnt out, but you're not seeing them with their head in their desk, you need to be able to understand that. So being able to, one, have this safety to raise that, and two, the opportunity to raise that, I think is super important.
It sounds like proactivity, critical thinking to ask good questions are among skills that are very important for team members. Just because as a final wrap-up question for this part of the panel, what are 2 skills beyond those that you think team members should have to be successful in hybrid work? And we'll start with you, Scott.
Time management. probably the most important thing. I think when you're in an office, you're kind of naturally moving around with the flow, but I think all of us now have experienced that the boundaries are just evaporated, obliterated maybe. So having good time management, both in terms of being productive, but also being able to step away and not do work. Or, one of my techniques is I literally take my phone and I put it in a drawer, because otherwise I'll be, on it all the time. It's just impossible. So getting away from work, or just scheduling some downtime where you can just walk or think, or, I've even just been blocking time on my calendar for lunch. Just so, otherwise people will just, go wall to wall meetings around that. And then probably, I think I talked about more of the writing skill. I think it's important increasingly to be very good writers, where you can communicate what you're doing to, if everybody's not around you and you can't just assume that you're going to formally update everybody, how do you communicate to a broader audience without having to have a meeting for everything? I think that everyone's influence is going to be proportionally related to how good they can write, which is ironic. You're thinking we're in a new world, but writing ultimately is still an incredible skill.
I would agree with those two. Absolutely, Scott. I think to add to sort of softer skills, if you will, I'd say empathy is huge. Just the ability to understand that remote especially tends to be very uniquely personal. Understanding that somebody may have their kids at home. They may be living with 6 roommates. They may be very introverted and uncomfortable in being on a Zoom. Having the ability to ask yourself, what does this feel like for somebody else? I think is essential, especially from the leadership point of view. I also think patience is an undervalued component and sort of skill in the remote world. I think naturally, when you get fired up about something, you want an answer, you want to work on it, you want to talk about it. And again, moving to asynchronous means that sometimes you have to press pause. You have to very thoughtfully craft those questions. You have to wait until you can meet with that person if that's what's needed, or to write out that documentation if that's what's needed. And that can be hard, that can be a big move for people. So I think empathy and patience are just two that go hand in hand to make sure that you are creating that inclusivity and that equitable experience for everyone in the room.
I totally agree. I would put in a plug. I really like the book Radical Candor. It's a book I've read recently, because I think it talks about, in order to be an effective leader, you need to show that you genuinely care about people. And it can't just be gratuitous. You have to build those relationships. So I think it's a good kind of toolkit on how to do that. And then I'll throw out just a fun pop culture reference. My wife and I are watching the show Madam Secretary, and I think that the main character is the Secretary of State of the U.S., and she has an amazing way of being very direct, but effective, like never compromising, never being too shrill, but almost always getting her way. I think it's like a masterclass of how to get what you want in difficult situations. It's also a fun show.
Great tip. I feel like there was a LinkedIn post just the other day that was saying, folks need to get more inspiration from TV and media and TikTok and all these places. There's so much content out there these days, but if you're looking at it through this professional lens, it can be really valuable to translate some of those skills. When I used to be a coach, I always encourage people to take improv classes so that you can be receptive to the people that are across from you, responsive. So great advice, Scott. We have one question. There was just a clarification somebody wanted about, do folks see wandering around as viable? It's ironic because folks will walk into a cafe, etc. That's okay, but I wonder if leaders will see walking outside as the same thing.
The question is it viable?
Yeah, I think they were curious. When I spoke about walkie-talkies, that was a once a week walk with a colleague. And I think this person was questioning whether, are leaders comfortable if their employees are going to be walking outside or, wandering around. So, in my space, it's a very structured walking conversation.
I guess I would say, I think in lieu of everyone being together, walking around, wandering on the telephone is good. I would say when we get back to normality, it'll be more like these. What I like to do is meet people for coffee and take a walk. And also what I was doing a lot back in the office is having walking meetings, where instead of just being sitting down, I think the idea of walking, I saw some research that said that for men, men looking together in each other's eyes is seen as very confrontational. So if you want to have a very hard conversation, especially male to male or with another man, It's good to kind of look at the side where you're walking together. It just feels a little bit less confrontational, more informal. I mean, it probably can generalize to everybody as human beings, but I've found to be a good technique, especially when you're having a very difficult conversation and you just go out for a long walk, and usually it gets received better than when you're sitting right in front of someone where it's really difficult, and it's hard for someone on the other side to look at you and you're having that tough conversation.